Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tim Gilkerson, and on behalf of the in-house community, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on employment law, which is COVID-19 recovery planning and future workplace planning for Asia employers. And we're privileged to have three really excellent speakers to talk to us this afternoon on this topic, in Julia Gorham, Wan Li, and Paul Cutrone of Seyfarth. Now, before I hand over to our presenters, just a couple of quick housekeeping notices. First of all, we do like this to be an interactive session. So on your screen, on the right-hand side, you can see your control panel. At the top of that, if you can't see the full control panel, there's a little arrow in an orange box, and you can open the panel that way. You can ask questions, and we encourage you to do so. Please just click on the questions tab and you can type your questions in there. Once you do that, we will make sure our presenters are aware that the questions have come in. And if they can answer them during the presentation, I'm sure they will. However, it may not be possible for them to answer all your questions during the presentation. So we will make sure they're aware of them. And if not during the presentation, I'm sure they will respond afterwards. Secondly, for those of you who require Hong Kong CPT accreditation, there is one CPD point accredited to this course, and if you can stay online at the end of the presentation, then there'll be a few questions. Just fill those questions in and send a response form to us, and you will be accredited accordingly. Right, that's enough for me and the platform. At this point, I shall turn off my camera, and I shall introduce today's speakers for this presentation. And I'll start with Julia Gorham, who's a partner at Seyfarth Shaw based here in Hong Kong. Hello, Julia. Julia specializes in employment law, including international employment and human resource projects, employment law compliance, strategic risk management, litigious employment disputes, internal investigations, and strategic advice at C-suite and executive level. Julia has significant experience providing advice to clients across a wide range of industries, and was previously in-house counsel at a global investment bank. Julia is joined by Wan Li, who's also a partner with a firm here in Hong Kong, a multinational legal practitioner with good sense of different cultures, markets, and laws. He assists Chinese and foreign clients on a broad range of cross-border corporate transactions, as well as investment, employment, and dispute resolution matters. And he's helped many domestic and foreign investors by bridging the gap between different cultures and knowledge of doing business in China and overseas. Hello, Wan Li. Finally, Paul Cutrone is a partner with Seyfarth Shaw in Sydney, which is where he's joining us from today. Paul assists clients with their health, safety, and environmental legal risks and impacts. This includes working with clients to identify opportunities, to proactively manage challenges, as well as being responsive in a crisis to minimizing the consequences. An award-winning leader in this field, Paul is a sought-after advisor by a number of the world's largest corporations. So thank you all for putting these presentations together, and it's over to you.
Good everyone, and thank you for the kind introduction, Tim. Today we're going to do a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and I apologise for some of the speed at which we'll be going through these issues. There's been a huge amount obviously happening for all of us in the employment space over the last 6 months, and sadly I think 2020 has yet more surprises to come. So what we're going to look at today is what were the key issues and the key questions that our clients were asking us over the past few months during the sort of the height of the crisis. Then I'm going to hand over to Paul, who's going to look at sort of some of the standards and best practice around managing the health and safety aspects, which is obviously a key piece of this, and it really goes to the obligations of the C-suite and some of the big ticket number items that can flow from getting it wrong. Finally, we're going to look at what happens next. So many of you are already in the phase of looking at return to work. But what does that mean? Does that mean cost cutting, retrenchments, and how do you redesign what you want from your workforce and what you want from your workplace? We'll give you a bit of a high level, predominantly from Hong Kong and China in terms of the specifics. I'll give you some anecdotes from the rest of Asia that we're seeing, but obviously if you have specific questions about other parts of the region, please drop us a line afterwards and we'll try and answer those. So I'm going to give you a couple of slides which have some statistics, which I won't go through in detail, but you can digest afterwards at your leisure. Some of these, a lot of surveys being put out, particularly around sort of the ILO numbers around the economic impact on workers and employees of the crisis, which we know has been severe and we know will continue through the rest of 2020 and materially into 2021. Obviously, certain sectors are harder hit than others. The retail sector has taken a battering, as has transport and tourism. But manufacturing itself also took a bit of a downturn, but we're slowly seeing some growth in that sector, particularly from China, which is good news. This was a particularly interesting survey from Randstad, and I'd ask you to have a look at that separately afterwards. The notable thing with this survey was actually the commitment to hiring with some of these companies that did the survey. While many of us are on a sort of a hiring freeze at this point and sort of salary freezes and all those things, actually people are planning ahead for strategic hires. But what we think that will look like is very much targeted hiring in key jurisdictions rather than pure volume hiring. So if I look at what are the day-to-day questions that our clients have been asking us over the first few months of this year? Obviously, at the height of the crisis, so we're talking sort of January, February, for most of us in Asia, before the rest of the world caught up with us, we were screaming, asking our colleagues in the US and EMEA to send us face masks when we couldn't buy them, and eventually the rest of the world caught up. So, the first questions, as you all know, was, what do we have to do with our offices? Do we have to close our operations? What do we do with our staff? Do we have to report to government agencies if we find that staff are positive? Do we have to pay people during quarantine? Those questions, I think, have slightly dropped off in the current paradigm because people have got much more comfortable with those issues. The pay for quarantine is one area that I do want to pick up on because the approach on that has differed across a lot of the Asian jurisdictions. Most of the Asian governments have put out recommendations to encourage employers to continue to pay their staff during a quarantine or a self-isolation period. In places like Hong Kong, where we have generous sick leave entitlements, you could potentially apply sick leave during those periods. I think the wrinkle comes where you've got employees who are choosing to go on holiday or choosing to travel and put themselves in a situation where then quarantine is required. In that situation, a lot of our clients are saying, well, if those individuals cannot work from home and they've put themselves in a position where they cannot fulfill their job at their own choice, then that might be a situation where you tell them they need to take annual leave for that period, or you may agree with them that that's a period of unpaid leave. So really that's a bit different across the region, depending on sort of the jurisdiction in which you operate. But the theme from most of these questions has been that the Asian governments really encouraged employers to have a discourse with their employees, and most Asian governments appealed to employers to do the right thing by their employees, to keep paying them if operations were closed for a few weeks, to look at giving sick leave and annual leave to cover any down periods, and to negotiate pay cuts if needed or periods of unpaid leave on a consent basis. And that's very different from the approach that was taken in the US and EMEA, which was much more government driven. The other thing I want to talk about particularly is things like asking employees to take mandatory annual leave. A lot of our clients sort of took the view that asking employees to take mandatory annual leave was a bit of a cost saving from the business or helped them manage the risk of having large annual leave balances at the end of the year. Now, in a lot of Asian countries, what we found over the last few months is that you cannot ask people to use up their annual leave. And that approach was predominantly driven from the fact that annual leave is intended to be a rest. It's intended for that health and safety, rest and recuperation. And governments generally don't like forcing people to use that to cover a period of business downturn. That doesn't apply everywhere, so it is a question that you need to think about. For example, in Hong Kong, we can ask people to take mandatory annual leave. We just have to follow a consultation and notification period beforehand. With the annual leave balances, yes, we do think that people will have more annual leave held over this year. A lot of companies will normally have a standard holdover arrangement of, say, 5 days that you can hold into the next holiday year that you have to take say before March. What a lot of the more advanced companies are doing is saying, right, we'll extend that. We'll allow you to hold over, say, 10 days, and you can take it by Easter or, say, mid-year next year. So that is an option for you. You obviously don't have to do it, but just bear in mind that there are restrictions in cashing out leave in different jurisdictions where you're operating. The one on the last column there, where I'm talking about immigration and tax, we had a lot of employees who were stuck and displaced, certainly at the beginning of the year, either because lockdowns took effect when they were overseas coming back from holiday, or they had been on business travel. Some of those people genuinely did get stuck, and we thought at that point in time that this was short-lived, and maybe they could sit somewhere for 2 to 4 weeks and this would all be over, they'd be able to come back to work. That hasn't been the case. What do you need to think about if you have people overseas? You obviously need to think about whether they are accruing employment rights in that other jurisdiction. So you could end up with a situation where they have employment rights in their home contractual jurisdiction, but potentially employment rights in the other jurisdiction in which they are currently living. Likewise, is that immigration compliant? They may be in breach of different immigration and visa requirements. Likewise, paying tax and social security will be an issue. The one that people genuinely forget about is the permanent establishment risk. Now, this is something we're not going to cover in detail today because it's really a corporate tax point. But people are very blasé about the fact that I can go and work from Singapore, I can go and work from Bali, which would be lovely at this point in time. What that can create is that can mean that the business that owns my employment contractually may create a taxable corporate presence in that location which I'm operating. Now, that is never ideal from a business tax perspective, and you need to think about that before agreeing to long-term arrangements and make sure that your tax advisors have checked that. The final point I want to mention on this point is for those of you who are working in a regulated business, anyone who is a licensed individual whose license is, for example, tied to the regulator in Hong Kong, if they are going to be operating on a regulated basis outside of the jurisdiction, you need to think about whether they need temporary licensing approval in that other jurisdiction. Otherwise, you could fall foul of your regulatory obligations. The other thing that we have seen a lot of people doing is the bottom one in the middle there, in middle column, cost management, people withdrawing offers of employment. Generally, obviously, very upsetting and needs to be handled very carefully. The one point to note there, generally you can withdraw offers of employment before someone starts work, but just think about whether someone has actually spent money in terms of relocating their family, for example, to take up a new employment. If so, do you need to give them some sort of leeway or some sort of compensation for that? It's not always the case, but just bear that one in mind. I'll come on and talk about collecting data for people, people's health and travel in the next slide. But I do want to just touch on identifying and managing critical teams and infrastructure. Most of you have already been through this process because you've had to work remotely over the last few months. But this is something that we see coming back around, certainly as we get to the end of the year, potentially with cold and flu season. So take what you've learned now about how you've operated. Did your split team arrangement work? Do you have key individuals that you need on separate teams so that if one person gets sick, you can still function? You've got to make sure that you've got those teams mapped out and that you know how to use them going forward. So in terms of Hong Kong specifically, we never really had full lockdown, but clearly I wrote these slides earlier this week, and now it looks like from Monday we might be heading into one, so bad luck for Hong Kong. But we are going to be in a period of rolling restrictions, so we need to think about being nimble, looking at what we've learned and making sure that everyone is ready to adapt and be agile in terms of their working arrangements. The government was very keen to encourage flexible working, but did not mandate it. And as most people have seen, Asia was not necessarily that advanced in terms of culturally being able to work from home. In EMEA and the US, this has been around for a long time. And actually, the biggest challenge I see here is actually our people managers who haven't been used to managing their teams remotely and don't really actually have the management skills to understand what success looks like, what productivity looks like, and how to manage their teams remotely and get the right results out of their people. So I definitely think that in this intervening period, some training for your people managers is going to be absolutely key. We do have the employment subsidy scheme that most or some of you will be participating in Hong Kong. And just to remind you that there is an undertaking as part of that scheme that you do not make any staff redundant during that period. Now, it doesn't stop you doing that, but there are penalties and clawback against that subsidy that would apply if you do that. We have some very specific health and safety obligations which are listed there. The one I just want to touch on is the Employees Compensation Ordinance regime. The Hong Kong government said that they would consider whether COVID would be classified as an illness falling under the ECO regime. They've not yet made a determination on that because it is they're waiting for the ILO guidance, particularly around causation, how you actually prove whether someone caught the virus as a result of their employment. So touching briefly on data privacy, I know many of you have torn your hairs out talking to your EMEA colleagues about why health declaration forms are absolutely fine in Asia and why employees here don't care about signing them. It is not, a matter of human rights and our existential freedoms. Other people in other regions disagree. But where you are asking people and visitors who aren't your employees to sign health declaration forms, ask yourself a set of questions. The questions I ask are, what data is being collected? Who has access to it? Where is it going and where is it being stored? When will it be deleted? And why do we need it, crucially? For most of us, if you're temperature screening someone coming into the office, that data is not collected. You don't write down someone's temperature. If they're hot, they don't come in. It's very easy. They go home and get medical advice. Some people do write that on the forms, and then just bear in mind that might be sensitive personal data for some of the data privacy regimes in the region, and you need to take extra care with that. But this data is also obsolete very, very quickly. If someone has had a test recently or has come into the office, they could get sick the minute they walk out the office. So this data is really not going to have a lot of currency for very long. So you need to make sure from a data retention perspective that you're actively thinking about when do you destroy those declaration forms and make sure that you're not keeping them excessively long. In terms of testing, of course, some companies are looking at asking employees to test. I'll touch on that later, but if you are asking employees to test and you are recording the results of those tests, again, treat that as sensitive personal data and make sure that it's properly protected. And again, the currency of those test results is not going to be very useful. What we would recommend is, certainly for the larger employers in the region, if you are having people getting tested or seeing sort of a relatively high number of cases in your population, keep anonymized statistics of that, because that might help you with your BCP planning for a future wave, for cold and flu season, or, God forbid, a future pandemic. So anonymized data helps you with planning for a future event. I'm going to skip over some of these. This just gives you a little outline of some of the other measures that are being taken across Asia. Feel free to drop us a line if you want specifics on any of those. Likewise with wage subsidies. And Wan Li, I'm going to hand over to you to look at PRC.
Thank you, Julia. And on the PRC side, because there's a lot of things, so we probably just touch on those key issues, and we can always follow up with Q&A or follow up, and we will be very happy to advise and communicate if you have any questions. Now, everyone knows in China, full lockdown in many locations, and probably the first one is Wuhan and Hubei province, and that lockdown is really unprecedented, and nothing happened in China before or anywhere in the world. Basically, the armed force moving, armed police movings, and all the district, all the living area with lockdown. It's a really it's the military control, and initially the viruses cause big panic, so the government want to use a special method to crack down and control the virus. And with all these, and we saw that in the near or neighboring city or province, although it's not fully locked down, but they have a sort of a self-imposed lockdown. For example, I give you in Shanghai or Beijing, and many people cannot get out of their home or their small region or some area that give you like a 2 tickets every day for every family. So to keep every family maintain the necessary need when you have to, throw the garbage, or you have to buy some foods and grocery. And so at the time, it's really shocked the many Chinese, of course, also around the world. And related to that is the because of lots of people stay at home, and so many companies feel the pain because they have to pay. There is a cost, like they have to pay wage, they have to pay rent, they have to pay many other things to support their production. But because of the lockdown, they have a cost but no revenue. So many companies start to consider layoff or shut down. We basically daily receive many inquiry from many parts of the world, because lots of the foreign investment companies, they operate in China. They want to consider how to lay off, how to shut down, but the government at the central level and also the local different provincial and city level, although there is no formal law or regulation, but they effectively send a message that they will discourage any company to lay off staff or shut down their operation. And of course, the government experienced a very difficult time, and so they have no sort of a wage subsidy, and although there is some social security rates, because in China everyone knows there is a sort of a social insurance fund that employee must make a contribution, and so the government basically said, okay, they will allow small and medium company to have some sort of a 3 weeks initially break. They don't need to pay anything, and later on they found the virus in fact is lasts much longer. So then the follow-up notice or rule said small or medium company don't need to pay the social security mandatory part. It's in China there is a 5 components. The 3 components they don't need to pay until the end of this year. But for large company, they got 50% of a break. For example, if they have to pay $100, now they can pay just 50, but only for 3 months. And so there's some kind of a release for many employers. And in the meantime, the government says, we give you some break. In the meantime, you need to keep the employment of your employee, and you need to pay the employee. And so it becomes the obligation, and very specific in that special period of time. And the obligation for the employer to maintain safe and clean work environment. So they need to keep the well ventilation system. They need to provide face mask. They need to provide hand sanitizers and all these things. They need to provide some sort of a training for the employee as to how to wear masks. They also need to sort of educate the employee how to keep the social distance, all these things. So it's the employer need to do all this, and obviously the employer have the pain and have to adjust their working hour. If they cannot lay off the employee, they still have to pay. So we help many foreign investment company to adjust their working hours. And so for some time they can do less, but when the high season, high time, they can get the employee to do more. And in the normal time, that is difficult. You need to get approval, but with the special period, and it is allowed. And also there is something that we structure for many foreign investment company to do some sort of a pay leave, no pay leave, annual leave, and welfare leave to reduce all these costs. The current status, you will see with the reopening of the economy, and the government now encourage all the employer to open the economy and also provide the help. But in the meantime, they need to check and keep the sort of protection and control regime. The two major one is tracing mechanism. And in China, everyone have what we call health code. For a foreigner, there is a health kit. That one effectively help the government authority tracing everyone, wherever you go or go anywhere, they know where you are. When you go to the public transport, you need to show that one. And if it's in green, they will allow you in or allow you on. If you are red one, then you probably will be rejected or even sent to the hospital to do some tests. And then is a testing, and there's a testing, quarantine, and medical treatments. And more and more, the Chinese government sort of developed the process and procedure, and also allowed the employer to release that part so employee can claim the test cost under the medical insurance. And so I hope that you may have some practical issue we can talk about at the Q&A session. Okay, back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Wan-Lee. Before we move on to the health and safety section, why don't we do a quick poll and see what all of you are looking at in terms of measures to your organisation. So poll question coming up. Okay, so that's interesting. So about 72% of you said that you would be looking at health declarations. So that's not really a huge surprise. And I think that's probably the safest and easiest thing to implement at this point. 12% said they were looking actually at an organization-wide tracing app. Now that's obviously going to apply to the larger organizations who have the resources to be able to roll something like that out. And that allows you to track sort of potential points of contact across multiple office sites, particularly in one country. In terms of antibody and COVID testing, 3% said they might consider antibody testing, and only 7% said mandatory COVID testing. And I think that's absolutely consistent with what we would expect to see. There was a lot of chat predominantly coming out of the US. Maybe it's because it's so litigious in the US that a lot of employers are asking the question of us here about mandatory testing for their employees before they're allowed to go back to the workplace. And we just don't see that really as apart from anything else, an employee relations experience that you want to put your staff through, but also necessary in the circumstances. There are other ways that you can keep your staff protected, asking people to self-isolate and use proper hygiene being the obvious ones. So now I'll hand over to Paul, who's going to look at the health and safety aspects.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you, Wan-Lee. Julia, we might move to the next slide if that's okay. Thank you. So as Julia and Wanley indicated, we're not really going to dive into particular jurisdictional issues, but we really want to sort of step back and look at the globe from space, so to speak, and consider this risk in that context. And what's really important to notice is whilst we tend to look at this risk through the paradigm of the country in which we operate, it's important that we defer to what the various legal regimes require in the various jurisdictions. And as I said, we're not able to cover every jurisdiction today, but we can certainly help you if there are some questions post this session. But it is important to recognise that the health and safety regimes vary from country to country. Some are criminal jurisdictions, others tend to be more civil based. Some are criminal jurisdictions with high enforcement and heavy enforcement. Others are criminal jurisdictions that stand to present a strong enforcement regime, but there's little actual criminal law enforcement of prosecuting matters where there have been breaches. Now, one thing I'd just like to say is that when you look at this COVID-19 issue, obviously it's a dynamic risk. It's changing day to day. It's very difficult to track what's happening around the world in any given moment. And accordingly, I think there's been a little bit of latitude for employers to get their systems into play, get their systems working and optimizing. But I think as we create a lag where there are certain expectations that everyone should have had enough time to well instruct, inform and train their employees, the tolerance of regulators in various jurisdictions are starting to fray a little, in that they're expecting companies now to have in place appropriate systems and processes to manage the COVID risk. So I think it's really important that when you're looking at this risk globally, that you are deferring to the local jurisdiction of each country, looking at the body of knowledge within it. Sometimes it's run by the health, the Ministry of Health, or it might be the Health and Safety Ministry, or sometimes it's both. And it's really important to get across what the body of knowledge is, what the legal requirement is, and that's what we've been helping a lot of clients do. There's obviously a great focus on the physical protections. Clearly, the goal is always to eliminate. So if you can completely isolate yourself from other people, that's going to create the best scenario as a control to prevent the spread. If that can't be done, obviously issues from social distancing to face masks to sanitation, etc., is going to be critical. And what I don't propose to do is take you through what you already know in those spaces, and it's important to defer to the various technical and expert guidance that's being provided by the governments and advisory bodies. But an area that's been starting to really manifest during this period of time has been what I would call the ripple risks, that is, dropping the stone into the pond and the ripple effect. Issues like mental health has been a major issue, and it's very important that there's consideration of those psychosocial risks in the workplace associated with what's going on. And it's accepted that these are unprecedented times, but we do have the tools and the processes to try and minimise and soften the psychological risks in the workplace, from issues such as employee assistance programs and counselling, and even the manner in which we deploy our various controls in the workplace. It's very important that often when you are implementing measures or controls in the workplace, you're thinking about the psychological impacts of how you're doing that, or the decision making, because they can trigger in certain jurisdictions health and safety obligations. Another area that I haven't noted there, but some guidance has been put out around, is in certain sectors, aggression has been on the rise. So employees facing aggressive circumstances in retail, for instance, and having in place appropriate processes to both manage that exposure to the employees and inform the customers of a zero tolerance approach to that type of behaviour. So aggressive customers and aggression in the workplace in general is also a key area. So it's very important, I think, to make sure that there is an ongoing assessment of these risks, monitoring the effectiveness of the controls and continuing to calibrate them to maximise success, both in the physical and remote workplace scenario. And clearly there are those challenges around managing the health and safety risks as we work remotely as well. And this is what I would call all these ripple effects: psychological risks, remote working, aggression, a whole range of issues are creating unintended consequences from dealing with this dynamic risk of COVID-19. Julia, we might move to the next slide if that's okay, please. And one of the things I think we need to do is, it's almost this cycle of when you're hearing we're in our second wave, we're going to our third wave, we're locking down again. It's really important to recognise that it's kind of two sides of the one coin. There's that initial response, and then we're monitoring the guidance, we're systemising our processes, looking at control effectiveness, we're consulting with our workforce to get the best feedback on how those controls are working. We're seeking to report and get live data on how effective our controls are and our processes, verify them and enforce, and then we work on improvement. And then all of a sudden, potentially we're back into a second wave and we're back to initial response, and we're working through this cycle. And it's this constant cycle of improvement and calibration, which is making the processes that we use to deploy and operationalize to keep our employees and others safe is what's most critical. And so I think it's really important to recognize that cycle, go through each phase and say, well, how was our initial response? What can we do? How are we monitoring our ongoing guidance? Are we systemizing and consulting well? Are we hearing what we need to hear? Is our reporting effective? Because if it's not effective, our response is ineffective. Are we verifying that? So that's part of that process. And one of the key things I think is really important is enforcing. And enforcement doesn't always have to be a firm side. It can be encouraging as well, encouraging the right behaviour and discouraging the wrong behaviour. But I've observed on many occasions, just walking around, you'll see the controls, and often you'll see people disregard them, and there'll be people who have roles that are to enforce them, and they're not doing anything. And as I talked about with regulatory enforcement, it has no force if it's not enforced. And it's same with health and safety controls. If they're not enforced, then you're really leaving it up to the belief of the individual, and we can't do that. I mean, the requirement is we need to enforce our controls and our expectations, and then we focus on improvement and that cycle again. Julia, I might move to the next slide. Thank you.
Paul, we'll take over from you, given your internet is slow. So Paul was just talking there about the guiding principles under health and safety. Obviously, we have across Asia, we've got a statutory overlay, but we've also got a common law overlay. What Paul's talking about here in terms of guiding principles is really best practice, and it's driven out of the high bar jurisdictions. So where Paul sits, obviously with a lot of heavy industry and mining, you get very, very serious health and safety issues. And that has driven this very, very high bar in terms of guiding principles and standards. So obviously, if you work to the high bar, you improve your culture and your climate, management buys into that. And then you set that as the cross-border risk management threshold for all of your health and safety issues. I'll hand back to Paul quickly.
Thank you, Julia. I'm sorry. We obviously had a network connection issue there. And then I think the final point I just talk about is clearly building in this process around how you put the framework in place from a good practice perspective. And you're obviously trying to drive a culture of good compliance with your safety controls. You are looking at those key controls and monitoring their effectiveness around this COVID risk. You're dealing with the crisis management side of things. So if you have a crisis, you've got the response, you're learning from it, you're mitigating the issues. You've got a proper process to look at the various risks in the jurisdictions, harmonise approach and raise things to the highest standard by using those minimum standards. And obviously an effective reporting, governance and assurance program, because the only way that you really can drive control effectiveness is monitoring it, dedicating appropriate resources to it and verifying its effectiveness. So I'll stop on that point. Thank you, Julia.
Okay, thanks, Paul. We'll finish off by looking at what does the future look like. So Paul's already mentioned a couple of times the importance of planning. When we talk about business continuity planning, certainly in the employment space, there are a vast range of issues that go into that plan. Paul's mentioned sort of some of the health and safety standards, which are listed here. But obviously we know that a lot of people are going to move towards the agile remote working on a more full-time basis or even a semi-permanent basis. Fujitsu in Japan, interestingly, has adopted permanent work from home going forward. They just made that announcement. Obviously, some of the big players, Google, Twitter, Facebook, Microsoft, have also come out and said that they are going to build in that flexibility on a more permanent basis. Interestingly, Siemens, German headquartered company, yesterday, so obviously the stuff is moving very, very quickly, came out and said they're going to ask their staff or allow their staff to work from anywhere, literally anywhere, for 2 to 3 days a week, on the basis that that location may be more productive for them. So keeping an open mind to what the future looks like in terms of agility is going to be really important. Dust off your other policies. So you can see there I've listed a few. When we look at the impact of working from home, working remotely, things like parental leave, carer leave, because this is not just about children, this is employees who have other caring responsibilities for older parents, for example, very important. Data breach, insider trading, the social media and electronic communications policies are super important, where people might be working in an insecure environment with people walking around their workspace or using Wi-Fi, for example. Make sure that you understand what that looks like. People can get offered sabbaticals now, which I'm all for, which would be lovely, as well as putting down some guidelines around what business travel might look like in the future, although I suspect that will take a long time to come. Obviously, business outlook and cost management. Many of you have indicated in the pre-survey that you might be looking at retrenchments. I'll come on to talk about some of the planning around that. But you might also be looking at outsourcing some of your functions. We know we loved outsourcing in the early 2000s. We might love it again by 2021. And obviously, with some of the supply chain breakdown during the crisis and some of the geopolitical issues, a lot of companies are looking at whether diversifying their strategic footprint is going to be really important for them towards the end of this year and certainly going into 2021. And if I move forward, so what are the key issues on the horizon? You can put these into different buckets, but one of the issues I think certainly EMEA is grappling with is, okay, so working remotely, working in an agile way worked really well, and people were productive. They said they really enjoyed it. In fact, most people don't want to come back to work full time. How can you require people to come back to work? And this is an interesting one, particularly in Asia, where you get, well, of course, people need to come back to work. And again, when I talked about training people managers before, ask your people managers, why? Why does that team have to be back in the office? Try and explain it to me. What is the issue with productivity? Is it about collaboration? Is it about needing sort of people in the office? How can that be managed in a way that can keep the workforce design moving forward in the way that your employees want it to, but still sort of work for your management team? We do foresee that discrimination issues might be on the rise coming out of this. We had thought that the agile working was going to be great for sort of gender equality because you had maybe both sides of the couple helping, you know, sort of balancing out sort of childcare and other caring responsibilities. As people are asked or forced to go back to work, that then turns on its head, and generally it is women who take over again in terms of the caring side, and so where that was quite an equal balance, it then sort of goes backwards a little bit. So watch out for requests to require people to go back into the office and think about whether that has a disproportionate impact on one group or another. You'll hear me talk about disproportionate impact because we have a lot of groups at play here. I've said there you've got vulnerable groups. We know that Black, you know, Middle Eastern, Asian nationalities or minorities are far greater risk of contracting COVID. So do you know who those groups are within your organisation, and are you watching out for them? Don't make assumptions about what your workforce looks like. Ask them. A lot of people are doing pulse surveys and sort of asking, you know, to stress test what employees feel comfortable with. So be careful not to make assumptions. Obviously, the financial impact that Paul mentioned, that the lower socioeconomic groups tend to be the people who can't work from home because the nature of their jobs doesn't allow that. But then they also generally don't have the sort of care system set up as well. So bear in mind that school closures and sort of care arrangements really do impact that group particularly hard. The US has seen an increased call for unionisation. We haven't yet seen that come to Asia, but you know, it's on my watch list of things to do. Obviously, in the US, you have less protections for your workers and your non-employees. Calls for minimum wages and sick pay, unemployment insurance, and parental leave. We may see that is a theme coming out across some of the regions in Asia. And finally, at the bottom there, you know, I've mentioned data breaches, insider trading. We are slightly concerned that people are working on non-secure Wi-Fi, working in environments where people's screens are visible, walking away from their screen without, you know, making sure that it's locked down, and not using encrypted platforms to convey business information could potentially give rise to greater risk here. So again, make sure that people are on top of that. And Paul's already mentioned mental health. In terms of cost management, many of you will have done a cost management exercise already. So across the region, generally asking employees to take a pay cut of around 10 to 20% was really standard. Some people went as high as 30%. Now, most people said that was a temporary measure or potentially in place till year end. I question if the economic environment has been rebalanced itself. Are companies now going to look to re-benchmark their salaries and make that sort of reduced salary actually the going forward salary and keep those pay cuts in permanently? I think that's something that we all have to assume is going to be on the list of things for management to consider. The other thing that I think is going to be coming is looking at your incentive arrangements, potentially looking at a higher stock cash split, so lower base salary, higher stock or incentive. And maybe making those incentive targets a much longer term buy-in, given that the economic recovery we think is going to be quite a long-term process. We also expect that employees are going to start asking for other types of benefits. So enhanced medical insurance is now obviously at the forefront in terms of managing the sort of situation we have now. You also may see an increase of people asking for severance to actually be baked into their employment agreements, given the vulnerability that people are feeling around their employment arrangements going forward. Assessing performance this year is going to be extremely difficult, so poor HR again is going to be at sort of the front of this debate. Think about whether your metrics and your targets are remaining the same. Have an early conversation with your line managers about, you know, making sure that they are not making assumptions about productivity just because of someone's, you know, childcare commitments or availability at certain points in the day. It sounds easy, but again, this is where the impact analysis comes in. Assumptions are very dangerous, and generally when those are made and they're not objective and they're not tested by HR, you walk into discrimination type issues. And I've obviously talked about outsourcing and the potential changes in terms of location. So I'll skip forward. I'm just giving you some informational slides here about redundancies across the region, which you can look at separately. A lot of people before this call asked actually for some information about redundancies. The key thing that we see people getting wrong when they are looking at redundancy programs is not planning. They sort of, you know, management says to HR and to finance, we need to do an X% cut and you need to do it by next week, and off they go. They're given no guidelines and there are no parameters around it and there's no plan. What happens then is employees don't react like a number on a spreadsheet, sadly, where you think you might be making a cost saving by going straight at it. The employees are likely to cost you more because they're going to raise issues with how the process was carried out. So, you know, go slow to go fast. The plan is super important. The way that you carry out redundancies and retrenchment across the region is very, very different in each jurisdiction. But the key principles that I would ask you to think about before you dive into an exercise like this are: check your thresholds for reporting. Do you have to report to government agencies? If so, what is the numeric threshold in terms of number of employees impacted that would require that reporting? Do you have formal consultation obligations, either to the employee population as a whole or to nominated representatives? If it's you know, in some countries you will have a collective threshold, and that will require collective consultation. Tends to be less serious here than it does in EMEA, for example. Then think about, are you talking about role redundancies, or are you talking about reductions in force? A role redundancy is where there is a unique role and you are stripping that out of the organization. A reduction in force is where you have a number of people doing a very similar role at a similar level, and you are just reducing the number of people that you need at that level. In all of those things, you need to look at how you select those roles to be released, make sure that that's done on an objective basis and that you have criteria that you can back up and that you can stand behind. In some countries, you're required to use certain selection criteria like last in, first out. The obvious places where that would apply is somewhere like India and Malaysia, for example. And I'm going to talk about risk review and impact assessments again. You know, the legal requirements need to be assessed, but actually you need to look at the population that has been provisionally selected for redundancy and ask yourself, have I got a disproportionately high number of women on this list? Have I got a disproportionately high number of minorities on this list? Have I got any special cases on this list? One of my worst memories from the global financial crisis 2009 was a husband and wife being impacted on the same day because the wife had not taken her husband's surname and no one checked the list. And when they went to HR said, oh, of course, I knew those were married, those people were married. And that could have been easily avoided had someone stopped, taken a breath and reviewed that list. So just talking about some specifics, certainly for Hong Kong, and I'll let Wan Li cover China very quickly. So Hong Kong, again, it's relatively straightforward in terms of process. You're not dealing with Indonesia and India, but you do have to have a valid reason for termination. People get this wrong time in, time out. We've had at least 3 clients this year say to us, oh, but you know, we can just terminate in Hong Kong, right? I'm like, no, you need a reason. Redundancy is a fair reason as long as it's justifiable. If you don't have a reason, there is a statutory presumption in our law that says that any termination is by reason of redundancy, and that entitles the employee to statutory severance. So if you get that wrong, you walk into the statutory severance requirements. What we don't have is we don't have procedural requirements. We don't have a set format in how you go about this, but we do tend to follow common law best practice and principles of fairness and UK case law. Like all countries, there are protected categories of employees, and I won't list these out. And there are obviously terminal payments that apply. In Singapore, again, you know, the procedural regime is not as fixed as it would be in other areas. The Ministry of Manpower obviously has responsible retrenchment guidelines, and they require you to try and mitigate the risk of retrenchment before you proceed. So, you know, what have you tried to do to avoid this? They do have a retrenchment benefit guideline of 2 to 4 weeks salary per year of service, once you've got 2 years of service or more. It's not a legal requirement, and we are seeing some companies just say, no, we're exercising contractual notice, this is not a redundancy situation, to try and get around that requirement. My personal view is, if you ask yourself why this is happening and you say this is a redundancy, then you should do the right thing and you should be following the MOM guidelines. There is a notification requirement which I've set out on the slide there. I'll ask Wan Li to cover China.
Thank you, Julia. And I think if anyone's involved in the sort of a China operation, they all know it is quite difficult in China to lay off staff or termination of employment. There's a fair bit of a regulation and rule and law will not allow the employer to scale down their workforce. However, there are some sort of a statutory item that you meet all these requirements, then you can sort of start a process. One of which we are going to touch is the layoff plan. Usually we call the redundancy, and then the employer need to give a 30-day notice to the trade unions and talk to all the employees about what the company want to do and reduce the staff and the reason for these things. And also you need to prepare a plan, and you need to submit all these to the local labor authority. And this is in fact very cumbersome process and not easy to proceed. And for example, they usually say if the layoff staff numbers more than 20 people, or if it's more than 10%. And very often in the real world, it's more than 10%. If you have only 20 people, you want to lay off 2 people, then you already sort of hit the sort of prohibit line. So very often we try to avoid that process. So when companies need to dissolve, and you need to pay the compensation, and you have to structure the way to avoid that. And in particular, in the area, we say reduce in force in the context of geopolitical tension. Now we all know the United States and China and other European countries. So we will see more and more foreign investment company will scale down or close down. We saw the news that a Japanese company provided billions of dollars to give the company to relocate it back to Japan, and the American government also provide the same. Consequently, all these will have an impact on the reduction in labor force. And if you have to go through the layoff, it will be very, very tough, very, very political size. So in the real world, for the past 2 or 3 months, we help many foreign investment companies to do the scale down, reduction in the labor force. We try to avoid all these. From time to time, we get in touch with the head office in Europe and in Americas. They are quite accepting and found it's a good idea, but the local in-house counsel or labor departments feel it's not doable. So we try very hard to convince them, and we tell them that we had many years experience to navigate all these difficult process and do all these in the most cost-effective way. And in the end, we help many multinationals to avoid, in fact, the layoff plan process. So alternative way to proceed is more cost-effective and less dispute. And of course, it's relevant to the company's culture and the company's commercial goal and the timeline with all these. And we'll be very happy to discuss about in more specific. And back to you, Julia.
Thanks, Wenli. So finally, I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to quickly cover 2 slides for you on what does the new workplace and back to work look like for our employees. So obviously there's going to be a huge debate continuing around remote working, the on-site working, and possibly a hybrid arrangement. The debate will continue, I think, into next year. But you've got to decide what is right for you as an organisation, but what is sustainable longer term. Yes, there's going to be social distancing required in any physical workspace, and a lot of people don't want to go back to work full time. But so how do you keep that workplace dynamic? How do you keep the spirit of collaboration as well as that sort of social distancing? So that requires a bit of a balance. What we are seeing is some companies actively giving their employees financial assistance to be able to work from home, so grants towards technology and costs. Some governments are even allowing for that. Some people are sort of creating flexible benefits packages. I know Aviva is one of those that allows you to take some of your benefits and apply it towards work from home equipment. We are starting to see requests for, can we require our staff to travel from a business perspective, certainly towards the end of the year, because there are critical meetings and critical clients that need to be sort of nailed down. You know, what do I think is going to happen there? Well, if you think about how to protect your people, business class might be what your employees ask for, but certainly outside of that, things like arranging for personal transfers so they don't have to use public transport or commute during sort of heavy hours. Think about whether you can provide a hotel for them on their return to their home jurisdiction, because again, if you put the employee in the first position here, if they're sharing a home with their children, their wife, their spouse, their husband, their elderly parents, if they've been on business travel and bringing something back potentially, they may want to self-isolate even if it's not mandated. So you may have to sort of think about covering the cost of that for a couple of weeks. Make sure that your company travel insurance covers medical costs as well as repatriation to their home location. Obviously, the building access and sort of physical building controls, you know, things like electronic doors and, you know, sensors, you know, if you don't have to touch the loo door when you go in, perfect. It should be an automatic opening. Likewise, for most doors, I think that will be something we'll see going forward. The hygiene measures, increased cleaning, a lot of, you know, the buildings are looking at sort of smarter aircon and managing humidity, all things that are currently being recommended by the WHO in terms of better hygiene. Masks, I'm not going to touch on the inverted commas political subject of masks because I think we're sick of it. Quite frankly, it's not a human rights issue, but you know, Asia's on top of the mask situation. What I would flag at the bottom there is, you know, Paul mentioned mental health. You know, we can expand that to well-being. People stuck at home physically, you know, not moving as much, emotionally probably a bit drained. We talk about Zoom burnout. I'm sure everyone's got a bit of that. Make sure that even though you're asking your teams to collaborate via video calls, that you're building in time and you're not pressurizing them to do that all through the day, because it can be pretty exhausting. We do worry about increased suicide risks. I've certainly had, you know, 2 or 3 inquiries over the last month about, you know, employees who people suspect might be on the edge. Make sure that you have a plan with your HR team about how to manage that. Cold and flu season, I say it's a bit of a joke, but to be honest, we think that using your COVID management mechanisms that you've developed thus far and then looking at what is best practice should be now applied to cold and flu season, because, you know, taking a whole group of people out with the flu has, you know, a similar impact to losing productivity. So why don't we plan to be agile on a going forward basis? So finally, a couple of people asked for some guidelines around remote and agile working. Obviously, this is a whole seminar in itself, but here are some of my guidelines. On the left column, you've got some of the current best practice issues that we would ask you to think about for your remote and agile working. And on the right column is things that you should think about if you're going to move people to agile working as part of your BCP emergency planning, either for a second or third wave of COVID or towards cold and flu season, for example. You know, in sort of Europe and Australia, certainly you're meant to ask individuals to do a homework desk assessment before they work remotely. Clearly that went out the window pretty much globally as people just had to go and work home. But if we try and think about this going forward, is that something you could arrange to be done remotely? There are many occupational therapists who have online setup videos to help people make sure that their desks and sort of home working environment is working well. So that's something that you should think about. On the performance side, you know, make sure that you're talking to your managers about how to set expectations around working time. Not everyone works in the same way. If you've got care responsibilities, you might want to work sort of irregular hours. As long as productivity is good, there should be no issue with that. But that does take a bit of a sea change in terms of management. We've talked about IT and information security. What I would say on the right-hand side is where I've said their key individual mapping, I would also include their vulnerable people. I mentioned that the BAME status people earlier. If you've got people who are high risk, either because they have medical problems or are in a high-risk group, make sure you know who those people are so that when this emergency hits, you can make sure that those teams are separated out to reduce the impact on those people. And I think that is where we're going to finish for now, and I'll hand over to Tim. Oh, we've got one question. If an employee is given notice of termination under their employment agreement during this time, would this be redundancy under Hong Kong law? Again, it depends on what the reason is. So unlike Singapore, where there is an argument that you can just give contractual notice, you can't do that in Hong Kong. It's really only a high risk where someone's got at least 2 years service, but you have to be able to pin a reason. So if you're giving notice, if you don't have another reason, yes, the statutory presumption that that is redundancy would apply. So unless you can show it's something else, poor performance, misconduct, for example, then it could be deemed to be a redundancy as a matter of law. Okay, I'll hand back to Tim.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Julia. Well, that was a very comprehensive presentation and a set of slides there. So thank you very much for that. I have one quick question actually for Wan Lee regarding China and the current situation. Wan Lee, if you're a foreign passport holder and you need to travel to China to fulfill your contractual employment obligations, are you able to do that right now? And if so, what does that look like? What's the situation like in that regard?
This is on the spot. Lots of expats in China, they got a problem. They have an employment contract in China, but they got a problem to buy air ticket to come into China. But in fact, if they know the issues, where the issues are, I think it will be able to help them to go through all this difficult time, because they probably found even they have a Chinese visa, right? They have a work permit, they have a resident permit, but they still cannot come into China. Yeah. So what they need to do is there is additional sort of a requirement relevant to the COVID-19. The Chinese authority want to make sure that you from foreign country, you're a foreign pass holder, coming to China, you are safe. So what they require the employees, they need to go to the relevant sort of a consulate general or embassy to apply for some sort of a approval. And in the meantime, the Chinese entity or the foreign investment company in China go to the Foreign Affairs Department in China also to seek some approval. Once you have the two sides of approval, one is from embassy or consulate general in the overseas, and the Foreign Affairs Department in China's approval, then that expat, if goes through the nucleic acid test, and if his test result is negative, then they can come into China. So right. The initial sort of arrangement now need to add some additional requirement. It's basically apply for the approval from the embassy and Chinese domestic foreign affairs department and nucleic acid test. So once you have all this, then you can come in.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you for that clarification. So thank you very much to Julia, to Wan Lee, and to Paul for coming in from Australia. And I'm sure there are questions. I can see other questions coming in now. But what we'll do is we'll pass them on to our presenters now. Or can we let me have a quick look at that question there. Perhaps Raoul can share it. I need to put my reading glasses on. We've got a question. Can you comment on the requirement of our reception colleagues to collect external visitors' declarations on their health conditions in case the visitors don't feel well? They will be asked to leave. Is that clear? I'll share that with you.
Yep. No, that was clear. You know, so if you've got a visitor coming into a site and they tell you that they don't feel well, they shouldn't be admitted. Simple as that. I mean, you know, a lot of our office premises, there's already a first set of, you know, temperature screening lower down that's conducted by the building management, for example. So people who have a temperature wouldn't get through. But if they do declare they've got symptoms, to be honest, we would send them home and politely decline. With collecting the actual health declaration forms themselves, as I mentioned earlier, look, that is personal data. and virtually every country in Asia has some form of data privacy regime, which requires you to store that securely, to only use it to the purpose for which it's collected, and to think about how long you need it. If you've got a visitor who's been denied entry to your premises, really that form is not that relevant. So if you look at it 2 weeks later, you don't know what the status of that individual is, you don't know what their health is. So I would say something like 2 to 4 weeks, you probably don't need to keep that form anymore. Really all you're doing is making sure that you have confirmed with your reception staff that they have asked everyone that question, and they haven't just been letting people through without asking the question. So from my perspective, that's the main issue.
Excellent, thank you, Julia. So if we have any further questions, of course, we will share them with our presenters today, and we will share the contact details of Julia, Paul and Wan Lee as well with you all, because I'm sure you have questions and you can contact them directly. You can also request a copy of today's slides as well, and they'll be made available after this presentation. So again, thank you all very much for taking part and making this presentation. Thank you everyone who's joined us online today. I know many of you have. And we look forward to presenting to you again, hopefully soon. Stay online to answer the post-presentation questions as soon as this closes now.